we should get going. Should we do? Hello, welcome to our conference today, which is also being live streamed. Contesting approaches to trade liberalization in the Asia-Pacific region will be done by Pak-Kun Heng, professor here at American University. We have a very excellent panel this morning from think tanks, government, and academics. And I'd like to welcome you as Michelle Egan from the School of International Service, American University. And I'll pass it over to my colleague, Fernanda Nicolas from the law school.
Thank you so much, Michelle and Robertus, for organizing all this. I see many of familiar faces of students who are either enrolled in EU law or they went on this program that I'm directing and is sponsoring this event. It's the program on international organizations, law and diplomacy, that takes place inside some of the main organizations that we're going to deal with today, namely the WTO, the European Union, and others. I wanted just to make two very quick points about why Michelle and I thought about this conference, and we brought people both from the legal, political, and economic world together, talking about convergence and divergence in mega regional trade and investment agreement. One issue that we discussed, and hopefully it's going to be brought up by the various panels, is more at the diplomatic and political level. The big discussions that we faced over these mega trade agreements with respect to transparency, participation, and many of the speakers are going to touch upon this. We've seen an experiment of tools and way through which the negotiators have tried to tackle questions of broader participation, inclusiveness, and transparency in these negotiations, which is very interesting. And another interesting aspect, I think, that especially for lawyers and our students who are here are thinking about their professional careers, it's certainly been the ISDS, the issue of state dispute settlement mechanisms that are very hot and quite controversial, but I think as lawyers we're really required to understand these mechanisms better, understand the subtleties and the way through which negotiators can negotiate the rules and understand the various policies behind the rules. So having said that, I won't take any longer. Thank you for being here, and I'll leave it to Michelle to chair this first panel. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to briefly introduce the panelists, and I'm delighted to say we actually are covering a spectrum of trade agreements. We are fortunate to have Colin Bird here today, who is the Minister Counselor for Economic and Trade Policy at the Canadian Embassy in Washington, and he's newly arrived. This is our second time that we've thought about CETA on this campus. We also have my colleague Pak-Kun Heng, who will be looking at, who's chair of the ASEAN Studies Center here in the School of International Service, and she is following multiple free trade agreements in Asia. We then have Roberto Peña, who is the Senior Trade Advisor at the Delegation of the EU to the United States, where he focuses on trade policy and will be talking about TTIP. And then I'm delighted to also introduce our fourth panelist, Yuri Dudish, who is at the Carnegie think tank here in town. And I'm hoping that having had both academic and official perspectives here, he will give us a more skeptical interpretation. Just so that you know, this is live streamed and will be available for a week. We will take questions from the audience. We encourage questions from the audience. And lastly, as we have two government officials here, if you are here as press, please note that they're speaking in a government official capacity. So please, if you have any questions or concerns, please ask us. Thank you very much. We welcome a good debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and really appreciate the opportunity to be here today. I want to go through maybe just a little description of what CETA is, what it means in the context of Canada's trade agenda, and then depending on time, look at sort of 3 or 4 divergence or convergence challenges that CETA poses, I think, for the world trading system and for the parties to the agreement. And then try to situate CETA in the context of Canada's overall sort of economic agenda and strategy. CETA is a very big deal for Canada. It's certainly our most ambitious trade agreement since NAFTA, and in many ways surpasses NAFTA in the breadth and scope of coverage that is involved. So for us, it's an agreement that opens up, a market of 500 million people for preferential access, a GDP of 18 trillion. Our share of that is relatively modest. It's a 90 billion thereabouts goods trade at the moment, but 30 billion in two-way services trade. But this is an agreement that, unlike, it's not the traditional goods and tariff reduction agreement of the past. We're anticipating that Canada-U.S. trade will increase in the range of 20 to 25% as a result of CETA. And that's about a $12 billion sort of income impact for Canada, which translates about, I think, to about $1,000 per household in Canada. So very significant economic benefits are anticipated, and that's based on the joint study that sort of kicked off this process quite a while ago now. I mean, we've been 5 years in the making of this agreement. From the first round, you can go back 7 years if you really want to see how long it can take to negotiate one of these mega deals. But we finally got to the point last September of releasing a full text of the agreement. We are now in the process of getting it translated into every official language of the EU and Canada, which I thought operating a country on 2 languages could be complex, but it's nothing like dealing with EU language issues. So that process is going to take a while. We'll be starting to see the implementing legislation aspect occurring this year. We're still looking at entry into force, at least on a provisional basis, by fall 2016 is the range that we're currently looking at. There's going to be full elimination of duties on non-agricultural goods. So 98% of tariffs lines on entry into force will be eliminated, and 99% by year 7. So it really does fit into, I think, the GATT 24 template for regional trade agreements. There are quite a few firsts in this agreement as far as Canada is concerned. This is the first agreement that we've had with a regulatory cooperation chapter. I'll go into that a bit more when we look at sort of challenges. It's the first agreement that we've had that incorporates into the text labor, environment, and sustainable development chapters. So it is an agreement that gives civil society a seat at the table, which I think is an interesting development in the evolution of these agreements. There is the provisions on labor mobility, I think, are certainly far more extensive than anything we've seen before, both on the EU side and on Canada's side. So it covers intercompany transfers, possibility of up to 3 years for movement between Canada and the EU. It covers contract service suppliers. It covers investment visits, business visits. So there's a real deep level of engagement, not just at the movement of trade, but the movement of labor as well. Government procurement, I think, is a real standout aspect of this agreement. This is an agreement where the level of commitments and undertakings on government procurement go down to the regional and local level and the provincial level on the Canadian side. That's a $2.7 trillion government procurement market in the EU that Canadians can now access. That's a level of ambition that I think anyone 5-7 years ago, if you said we'd get to where we are, I think they would have thought we were dreaming in Technicolor. So it's really quite extensive. The option within 5 years of having a sort of a single e-portal for bidding on government contracts is a real sort of pushing of the envelope on trade agreements. Certainly, the intellectual property provisions are deeper and have pushed the envelope further than we've seen in other agreements. And of course, the investment chapter, in particular the investor-state dispute settlement options, I think have been tweaked in a way that really take some of the lessons that we've learned from the NAFTA Chapter 11 process and dealt with many of the sort of concerns that folks have had over time about ISDS and have come up with a much more robust ISDS provisions. And we can, I'm sure, talk about that a bit more when we get into challenges. So this agreement, I think, is particularly relevant in this town because of the TTIP negotiations that are currently underway. But as much as it is a template for sort of modern free trade agreements, I think it also deserves to be looked on its own merits and recognizing that it reflects its own balance of sensitivities between the EU and Canada that don't necessarily apply when you get into an US-EU context. So convergence and divergence. I guess let me start very much at the sort of local internal side of that picture. One of the aspects of negotiating an agreement like this is you become aware of the imperfections in your own internal market. So in the EU, the process of harmonization of the internal market has taken many years and is still a work in progress. The same thing is true for Canada. Canada is, I think, the most decentralized federation in the world. I think it's the only country where most of government spending is actually done at the provincial level as opposed to at the federal level. And both when we negotiated the original Canada-US Free Trade Agreement back in 1989, so one of the outcomes of that was realizing we're now giving better access into Canada than we're allowing between provinces. And as a result of that, we created an agreement on internal trade to try to to drop barriers within Canada to the same extent as we were doing with the United States. The same thing, I think, is coming to the fore again with CETA. It has sparked a process of going back to our agreement on internal trade and seeing how it can be modernized so that we're not giving better access to Ontario from Germany than we are from British Columbia. It's a bit crazy that you can get great German and French wines in Ontario, but try to find a BC wine, and it's a bit of a challenge. So there I think is an opportunity, and I think the same thing is true. Roberto can probably speak to this more on the EU side. But one fallout from these kind of agreements is that there is that looking back inward and seeing what kind of trade liberalization makes sense internal to the member state or the union. So the next challenge like to talk about is just the reality of, for Canada, which has, the world's largest trade relationship with the United States, a deep level of integration with the United States in terms of standards, regulatory approaches. How do we harmonize with the United States, with the European Union, without jeopardizing the existing regulatory harmonization that we have with the U.S.? When you're looking at the difference in magnitude of our trade relationship, we trade every 6 weeks between Canada and the United States, what Canada and the EU trade in a year. So it is, orders of magnitude different in terms of size of market. And so, just as we have a 110 volt standard here, there's a lot of integration that has already occurred in North America that we don't want to jeopardize by virtue of creating a new relationship. Just last October at the embassy, we had about 500 Canadian and U.S. regulators and industry stakeholders and representatives of civil society in for a couple of days working through regulatory harmonization issues with Canada. It's an incredibly deep and profound relationship that exists between Canadian and U.S. regulators. How do you move forward with the EU? And the name of the game, of course, is equivalency. So you have for example, on the auto side, where you have an agreement by Canada to accept as equally valid standards 17 of the EU auto motorcycle standards. I think we're all there except for a few on the motorcycle and maybe passenger stability side already. But it's sort of built in that we're going to sort of accept as sort of equally valid those standards. We have a mechanism called the conformity assessment protocol that allows creates a model for Canadian and EU testing and certification bodies to assess and recognize each other's standards as of equivalent value, so that one test done at a Canadian testing facility for a product, whether it's a medical device or anything else, would be seen as comparable to a test in the EU, and that can be so what's created in the CETA is a mechanism for accepting a sort of equivalent value of those kind of measures. On professional licensing, so with the focus on labor mobility, we're looking at professional associations, whether they're legal or architects or engineers, tend to be very jealous of their turf, and can often be a significant barrier to the sort of free movement of services and trade. What the CETA provides for is a mechanism, an approach for professional associations to, on a reciprocal basis, accept each other's standards as equivalent. So there's already been a lot of work I know done amongst architects to sort of recognize equivalency and sort of mutual recognition, and that's sort of built into the CETA as a way to move forward. So you have provisions in the CETA to have early input into regulation making process, so that you can try to align to the extent possible. Canadians would have a right to participate in public comment and in EU regulation making, all designed to create more options for harmonization. And of course, there'll be a regulatory cooperation body to try to work through those issues as we go forward. So that's, in a nutshell, how we try to deal with some of the harmonization issues between the EU and Canada. But one other aspect is really trying to foreshadow any potential future agreement between the EU and the U.S. So there's explicit provisions in the CETA for when you might have a future TTIP or agreement between the EU and the U.S. You already see in terms of rules of origin, and certainly one of the challenges with the proliferation of these regional trade agreements is you get this spaghetti bowl of different rules of origin that can make life a misery for a customs officer. But you see in the CETA that the reality is that many of Canada's manufactured products incorporate a large element of U.S. Production and U.S. content, and so the CETA was negotiated to recognize, to create special rules of origin to recognize that reality that Canada and the U.S. make a lot of things together. And so how do we ensure that we still have access for those goods, even though they would incorporate more U.S. content than would normally be accepted under a standard rule of origin or a general rule of origin. Let's see. Maybe another challenge. I'm not sure how. If you want to stop me at any point.
That's the last challenge. This should be the response from the others too. Go.
Okay. Two, I think, on intellectual property, I think it's just worth noting that the process of creating the CETA did create an opportunity for reflection on Canada, on our standards, and where we were in terms of international norms, and to develop. So you saw during the course of the negotiation of the CETA, Canada acceding to the 5 World International Property Organization treaties, coming up with our Copyright Modernization Act, coming up with our Combating Counterfeit Products Act. And so in that way, I think you can see that, while certainly not determinative, and there's a lot of aspects of the Canadian IP regime that sort of reflect the balance that Canadians think makes sense, but it did create this opportunity to sort of look at our overall IP regime and see how it could, there could be greater harmonization. Maybe I'll just leave it there just to give some time.
Well, that leaves us a lot. It also suggests that both Asia and Europe have a lot to think about. I'll pass it on to my colleague here, Peck, who will give us a perspective of what's happening in the spaghetti bowl in Asia.
The largest spaghetti bowl in the world, noodle bowl. I just show you, I've got just a slides to share with you. Okay, this is my presentation, Contesting Approaches to Trade Liberalization in the Asia-Pacific region. And so just to familiarize you with what are the member countries? I'm looking at these 4. The ASEAN Economic Community, 10 members of the ASEAN countries. The Regional Common Economic Partnership, which includes the ASEAN 10 countries, plus Australia, plus ASEAN plus 3, which is South Korea, Japan, and China, and 3 more, Australia, New Zealand, and India. So that's 16. And then TPP, 12 countries. You have the ASEAN, 4 countries from ASEAN, Malaysia, Singapore, Vietnam, and Brunei. And then the rest comes from the countries that there, a couple of them from South America, Canada's in it, Mexico. And then the FTAP, so you call it RCEP, FTAP. FTAP comprises of 21 APEC countries, all these countries, and 3 ASEAN countries are not in FTAP. They are Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar. Now, so this is the percentage of world trade, you can see. In 2012 numbers, ASEAN Economic Community, small, 6.8% of world trade, RCEP, 32%, TPP, 26%, RCEP, because China is in RCEP, so that's why it's a larger share of world trade than TPP, and then FTAP, which is the 21 APEC countries, that would be the largest of all. Okay, then I'm going to show you a diagram of the spaghetti bowls. So here we are. So these are all the major trade, a bit of the ASEAN, the AEC, right? So the ASEAN, the 10 countries. And the next circle would be, there was a plan for an East Asia free trade that will only include an Asian-only free trade, Japan, China, and Korea, so the ASEAN plus 3. But when RCEP was formed, that included India, Australia, New Zealand. Now, and that did not include two other countries in the ASEAN's ASEAN major dialogue partners, which is US and Russia. They're not included because Russia and US are not free trade partners of ASEAN. Only the 6 free trade partners of ASEAN are included in ASEAN. It's an ASEAN-led initiative. And then you've got the TPP in the yellow, the countries in yellow, and then finally the FTAP is envisaged to encompass all the APEC countries, and India is not in APEC. India is not a member of APEC. Right, so let me just quickly make some comments that, so the ASEAN, the AEC, the ASEAN Economic Community will be established at the end of 2015 when Malaysia is the chair of ASEAN. And ASEAN will claim that, legitimacy, that it is legitimately established, but apart from the removal of tariff barriers, there are many, many areas that still require implementation, especially in the non-tariff barrier and regulatory beyond the border areas where, and this AEC seeks to to establish a single market production base. Second, to have a highly competitive economic region. Thirdly, to have equitable economic development to narrow the gap between the advanced economies and the least advanced economy, and to integrate the ASEAN region into the global economy. So these are the 4 objectives of AEC. And there'll be many more years before this will be achieved. RCEP, as you see, negotiations will conclude at the end of this year as well. AEC will be established, and RCEP the negotiations will be concluded, but not yet established. And RCEP grew out of a Japanese proposal in 2006, to have the ASEAN plus 3 plus the other Australia, New Zealand, and India. And in 2011, ASEAN formally launched RCEP to establish an ASEAN-centered FTA. So that's an ASEAN-centered FTA. Now, TPP, after the first round was launched in March 2012, so 2010, we've had 19 formal rounds, and talks are expected to wrap up later this year, hopefully, with the anticipated passage of the Trade Promotion Act by Congress. Now that Congress, Republicans are in control, there's a better chance that the TPA will be passed. Now, FTAP was first proposed at the 2004 APEC summit and was formally endorsed by President Bush at the 2006 APEC summit, and most recently revived by China when it hosted the APEC summit last November, when leaders agreed to launch a strategic study of the Chinese proposal. The US watered down the initial Chinese proposal for a feasibility study, which have meant, there would have been a more formal process. But now we have a strategic study that's going to be that's going to move forward for the establishment of FTAP. Now, all 4 frameworks seek to bring coherence to the many bilateral and overlapping multilateral FTAs in the region. They're designed to be complementary and not discriminatory, and to harmonize and standardize the different measures in the many bilateral FTAs. For example, the 6 bilateral FTAs that ASEAN has with its 6 dialogue partners will be harmonized in RCEP. And both RCEP and the AEC have open accession as a core principle. Benefits generated by the AEC will extend to non-ASEAN members, and RCEP countries with overlapping TPP membership are expected to extend their RCEP market access to TPP members. So it's a policy of open regionalism. it's non-discriminatory. But these free trade areas do represent two contesting approaches to trade liberalization in the Asia-Pacific region. The TPP is a high-quality, comprehensive FTA in contrast to the AAC and RCEP. These latter two represent a much lower standard, more flexible and sequential trade liberalization regime marked by significant carve-outs and phase-in timelines for the less developed countries. The more advanced countries will liberalize at a faster pace, and the less developed and more protectionist countries like Indonesia will receive special and differentiated treatment. So while the RCEP is an ambitious overarching FTA, it is one that will be based on the lowest common denominator. So you won't see, it will harmonize, it will promote trade, but there's still a lot of differences that will have to be worked out later on. Now, as we know, the TPP is the economic centerpiece of the U.S. pivot, rebalance to Asia. It seeks to build an Asia-Pacific FTA that will undergird U.S. economic and geostrategic goals in the region, and to construct basically a U.S.-defined 21st century neoliberal global free trade regime. As USTR Representative Michael Froman puts it, the TPP is a U.S. values-driven trade policy that will set higher labor, environmental, IPR regulatory, and digital commerce standards for all of U.S. trade partners. China initially saw the TPP as an American design to deliberately isolate China commercially. In the early 2000s, Beijing attempted to utilize the ASEAN Plus 3 to establish a China-dominated Asia-only multilateral trade regime, but the effort was thwarted by Japan, with support from Singapore, Indonesia, and some other ASEAN countries. And so the Chinese original ASEAN Plus 3 was then expanded to include the other three countries. So it became the ASEAN Plus 3 arrangement in RCEP. So stymied by the US-led TPP and the ASEAN-led RCEP, China's proposal to give new life to the FTAP last November signaled President Xi Jinping's desire to regain China's initiative in modifying US rules for a 21st century free trade regime in the Asia-Pacific. And by successfully getting the leaders at the APEC summit to embark on the strategic study, China now has three goals. Firstly, to prevent the TPP from becoming the focal point of economic integration efforts, and a reaffirmation of U.S. leadership as a Asia-Pacific power to dent the economic leadership the U.S. is represented by the TPP. And secondly, China's sponsorship of FTAP indicates that it is playing a more proactive role in drafting new rules of a Sino-centric Asia-Pacific economic order from a position of equal standing with the U.S. China seeks to dilute market-driven free trade standards in order to allow greater policy space for China's state developmentalist and neo-mercantilist practices. And thirdly, China also desires to gain a first-mover advantage in FTAP. If and when China joins a TPP after it enters into force, it would have to abide by the strict disciplines negotiated by the 12 founding members and would have to make significant concessions to ensure its accession in such contentious areas as environment standards, SOEs, IPR, competition policy, regulatory transparency, and ISDS, which China is not prepared to do at the moment. So China's trade diplomacy and roadmap for a new economic order also includes two other measures. The establishment of the ASEAN Infrastructure Investment Bank, 23 members have signed on to it, and China is pledging $50 billion towards its $100 billion fund, and tellingly, U.S. and its three treaty allies, Japan, Australia, and South Korea, have yet to join the AIIB. And of course, the AIIB is seen to be a rival to the Japan-led Asian Development Bank. Now, China will also fund a $40 billion economic Silk Road connectivity project, that will tie up to facilitate flows of China trade, two-way flows between China and its trade partners in the traditional and maritime and mainland Silk Road. So both projects will boost trade and investment between China and its regional trade partners, thus giving China additional political and economic capital when FTAT talks are launched. Beijing's trade diplomacy will also serve its geostrategic goals in bolstering closer political and strategic engagement between China and countries in the region. However, and this is important, I think it's unlikely to ameliorate tensions over disputed territories in the South China Sea that China has with other claimant states that will be, is now in RCEP and will be in the FTAT. So do these initiatives augur the emergence of a Chinese-led regional economic order in the Asia-Pacific? According to Brookings analyst Maria Solis, a former colleague of ours at SIS, she says it's a not yet. She gives an indeterminate not yet. She argues that China's trade diplomacy is not revisionist, but merely is reactive and defensive. Moreover, she sees China's endorsement of FTAT meeting a core American national interest with no lines being drawn in the middle of the Pacific, which the original ASEAN Plus 3 would have done. So, however, I argue that China has in a way captured or hijacked the original US vision of FTAT when it was first proposed in 2004, and will instead create a Sino-centric free trade regime. And that version of FTAT would depart in several ways from US neoliberal protocols and values pertaining to all these issues, competition policy and all these other issues. And some of these issues have already emerged as sticking points in the ongoing TPP negotiations for countries such as Malaysia and Vietnam. So these are really sticking points, and these are the areas that China will also focus on when it comes to FTAT. So if the TPP moves forward, it will demonstrate America's ability to have its own way. However, should the TPP talks reach an impasse, and unless China and Japan can deal with its, the agriculture and other issues, it's going to move ahead. And if the TPP reaches an impasse, China by default will be able to expand its economic and political clout as the epicenter of the world's largest supply chain network and potentially built up an FTAT with Chinese characteristics. A watered-down FTAT would have strong potential to serve as a vehicle for China to undermine US trade policies as well as become, and FTAT would be the centerpiece of Xi Jinping's new Asian order, which he articulated in November as well. So from an economic standpoint, the four frameworks, these four trade frameworks, in combination, hold great promise in removing trade and investment barriers. They will definitely remove substantially, especially tariff barriers. Though some of these approaches may move ahead quickly and others prove less successful, that outcome nonetheless will boost total trade in the region and will advance US commercial interests. On the other hand, if we look at the contesting approaches from a geostrategic standpoint, the stakes for American interests are considerably higher. There is a real contest between US neoliberal approach and China's developmentalist, neo-mercantilist approach to free trade regimes. So at the moment, the momentum is with the US, but with China beginning to move forward proactively with the FTAP, with the funding for the AIIB and the Maritime and Economic Silk Road, and other connectivity and infrastructural trade and investment policies, projects. China is likely to achieve its long-term geostrategic and geoeconomic ambitions should the TPP fail. So it is essential then that the US bring the TPP negotiations to a successful conclusion. And so I look forward to your questions. And I'm sorry I didn't touch on these, the nitty-gritty of the 20 chapters. But I'll be happy to talk about what are the actual issues of contention between especially Malaysia and Vietnam that have been looked at closely.
Thank you. You've left us with a lot to think about of potential significance of actually getting a TPP done. I'd like to turn to Roberto now, who will give us a sense of perspective on TTIP.
Great, thank you. And before I dive into TTIP, I just wanted to touch upon Colin's remarks, because I think he did a wonderful job of explaining the CETA agreement and the result of a well-balanced, well-negotiated, difficult at times, but certainly CETA reflects a balanced approach where Canada and the EU were able to respect each other's domestic sensitivities, and also, I mean, do groundbreaking work in areas like sustainable development. And Colin, also thank you, because you also really conveyed a lot of what I was going to say about TTIP. So you've done half the work already. In terms of the presentation we just had, I also felt it necessary to mention that TTIP isn't the only ongoing negotiation that the EU is conducting at the moment. It's currently conducting trade agreement negotiations with Malaysia, Vietnam, and Thailand. Also India. Again, we just completed Canada. Also in the process of updating our trade agreements with the Agadir countries in North Africa. So it's TTIP is part of a larger trade diplomacy that's being conducted, and as you saw, all the robust activity taking place in Asia, the EU is certainly engaged as well globally. Now let me delve into TTIP, and I'll step back and explain how we got to TTIP. We're heading into the 8th round of negotiations for the first week of February. So a lot has transpired over the past 2 years, but let me step back before we actually launch the negotiation. So the EU and the US have long-standing economic ties, but also strong government-to-government exchanges. And originally it was framed as the Transatlantic Economic Council, the TEC, and this provided for an annual EU-US economic summit where they discuss various aspects of the economic relationship. And more as the TEC evolved over the years, you found that the regulatory discussions were taking on a life of its own. A lot of the areas of interest for cooperation were in the regulatory space. So again, you know, in around this time as well, there had been I guess I would say a frustration with the stalled multilateral discussions, and the sense that and I believe you'll touch upon this a little bit later, but that the international rule book hadn't kept up with the modernized global economy. You know, very complex supply chains in Asia. You have developments in state-based capitalism. You have energy access and raw materials access questions. And so the EU and the US, again, as part of this ongoing economic dialogue that was taking place, they came to a joint decision to explore how can we better tap into the transatlantic economy. I mean, the EU and the US together comprise of nearly half of global GDP, about a third of global trade. How can we better maximize the relationship and tap into a growth to that could eventually lead to more jobs and economic growth in both jurisdictions? So they launched the high-level working group. And this was a year-long scoping exercise where both sides came together and looked at different ways in which you can actually achieve this type of growth. And given that current tariff rates are relatively low, there was a mutual agreement that the way to really achieve the further gains would be to do a comprehensive trade agreement, and the high-level working group report was endorsed by President Obama and then EU Presidents Van Rompuy and Barroso. And the recommendation was to launch into a comprehensive trade negotiation. And the EU, it took a little bit of time, but the EU received its mandate. from the European Council on various areas that it had the authority to negotiate on, and sort of a wish list by the member states of what the EU should be pursuing in a comprehensive trade agreement with the U.S. And with that, we entered into negotiations. I think of the TTIP as predicated on three pillars. So you have the traditional market access component, and these are things like tariffs. You have rules of origin, government procurement, traditional trade agreement type stuff, access to the services market, and locking that in for your companies in the other jurisdiction. The second pillar is I think the one that fosters maybe the most interest from people, because it's relatively new. We've done a iteration of it with Canada, but it's the regulatory cooperation component. And this I would say it's divided into two work streams. One is sort of a horizontal discipline. So what are the common attributes that regulators on both sides take into account when developing regulations? Obviously, both have their legislative mandates, but in terms of the impact assessments and the public comment process, there are questions as to how the process could better work and become more inclusive. The other part of the regulatory cooperation is in the various sectoral discussions that are taking place, and these are, I mean, they're led by the regulators, and it's in everything from pharmaceuticals to medical devices to the automobile sector. So as part of the TTIP, the regulators are actually getting together and figuring out how they what the common approaches are and how they could better share information, and what types of cooperation can they establish to streamline the regulatory process and make it easier to understand for large and small companies alike. The third pillar of the TTIP is the rules component, and this is also a very interesting area because it raises a lot of geopolitical questions. But things like access to energy and raw materials, so a lot of localization requirements that you're seeing in a lot of third country jurisdictions. So this is. They're very interesting discussions because these aren't traditional areas that are negotiated in trade agreements, and so the EU and the US are coming together and sharing each other's experiences and finding out, I mean, can you develop trade disciplines around some of these areas, and very much related to the topic that we're here for today is how would this reconcile in the WTO? What are the current rules that govern trade in this space? So it's a very interesting part of the discussions, and I would encourage you to keep a close eye because it's pretty innovative stuff. Again, we're going into the eighth round of negotiations, but these things take time. So it's a little under 2 years, I would say, that we've been in negotiations. I'm sure some of you are aware of the public debate that's taking place in Europe, and it's understandable for people to have questions about the TTIP. It would be the largest trade agreement to date. I mean, the two largest economic entities in the world negotiating a trade agreement. So it should prompt questions from the citizenry. So it's understandable. As a response to this, the EU has been very proactive in trying to make the TTIP the most transparent negotiation that's ever conducted. Earlier this month, our Trade Commissioner Malmström unveiled a transparency package as part of her fresh start. She's relatively new to the job, about 3 months in, And so one of the beacons of her tenure is going to be transparency and engaging the public on the TTIP. And so within this transparency package, we actually released several different negotiating texts that we've submitted to the U.S. government. This is unprecedented in terms of the level of public information that's out there now, that people can actually have a reference to what the EU is actually seeking out. In other areas, the EU has actually put out position papers. So these are, if you're familiar with the EU legislative process and the regulatory process, the EU oftentimes releases green papers and sort of exploratory papers that really pose a question, and it conveys to the public that the EU is thinking about this policy area and how to reconcile some of the problems that have arisen. So the EU's also published a lot of these position papers that let you know what the EU objectives are, what it would like to seek out in the sector. As part of the transparency package as well, we launched an initial public consultation on the TTIP, just wanting to get initial thoughts from the general public on what are the sectors that the EU and the US should be negotiating in TTIP. As a follow-up to that, it also launched an ISDS, Investor State Dispute Settlement consultation with the public, and because there's a lot of interest in the ISDS topic, the EU felt the need to sort of clear the air and explain what ISDS is and what it's not. And investment is a relatively new area of competence for the EU. It was given this competence following the 2009 Lisbon Treaty. So the EU was relatively new to the investment policy universe, and the first thing it did, it conducted a scoping exercise of the different previously member states negotiated investment agreements among themselves and with third countries. So the EU launched a scoping exercise to find out what are the obligations for investment protection that the member states have signed on for. It also established a transitional arrangement that grandfathered the old bits into a new investment approach related to the overall European Union market. What the EU also found in looking at the ISDS, I mean, it's a network of thousands of different bilateral investment treaties out there. I don't know if any of you are law students and have taken international investment law, but you know that it's a bit of a scattered network, and different bilateral investment treaties offer different levels of protection for investors, and so it creates a little bit of confusion as to what are the established global norms on investment protection. So the EU, being new to investment, decided that, and also in line with international organization recommendations like ICSID and the UN Commission on Trade and Development, who've also looked at this network of investment agreements and have made recommendations. The EU also came to the table with its set of additional improvements that could be made onto the system that could better, let me choose my words carefully here, better align the EU's approach towards a more to focus more on protecting foreign investors, but also upholding the right of governments to regulate in the public interest. And if you look at what the EU is proposing, I mean, we've put it out in position papers, it's all over our in ISDS consultation. It's really about incorporating better safeguards into the system so that if, you know, in extreme cases, you know, foreign investors look to the ISDS system to resolve a dispute, it's used for the appropriate purposes. And you can see that in what the EU's put out. And we also, about 2 weeks ago, we put out a report on the various responses that we heard from the public on investment. So I've talked a little bit about the 3 pillars. I've talked about our transparency package, the ISDS consultation, but I also want to leave you with a word on the aspirations of the TTIP. It's still in early stages, I would say, and we would like to accomplish as much as possible this year, provided that both sides reciprocate on each other's interests and also respect each other's sensitivities. I mean, in Europe we have political sensitivities, things that just aren't on the table. Unfortunately, if you've seen some press reports, there's a confusion about what's in and what's out, and certain things like food safety, things that are regulated at the domestic level at the EU aren't public services. These things aren't being negotiated in the TTIP, and so it's one of the reasons why we're trying to be so forthcoming and transparent about the process and just clarify what the scope of the agreement is. But in terms of the ambition, both sides want a very comprehensive agreement, and also the EU and the US coming together. I think it sets a really strong precedent globally of what new established norms that have been agreed to by 2 economic juggernauts. And in terms of the convergence or divergence with the multilateral system, I think the EU are the original multilateralists, and I think it was branching off into TTIP negotiations with the U.S. government took a lot of consideration among the EU and its member states, because they are such believers in the WTO system, and so the TTIP isn't intended to replace. But the hope I feel is that if there's a good comprehensive agreement that's concluded, that it might be something that could serve as a model to open up multilateral discussions, and you see this in the streamline of work that's being conducted right now at the multilateral level, which the EU and the US also work very closely in conjunction, and so that I think both sides really are strong believers in the WTO, and the TTIP is just it's an agreement. It's a negotiation where both jurisdictions can upgrade the set of rules that govern transatlantic commerce, but with a nod to the larger global economy in trying to address some of these global questions. So I'll leave it at that and look forward to your questions later.
Thank you. We've had 3 sort of really substantive overviews of what's going on the ground, and I'd like to turn it over now to Uri to give us a sort of perspective across the board. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Michelle, and glad to be with you today. I will look at the issues mainly from a development perspective, partly because that's my background, World Bank, etc., but partly because this is where the future of global economic growth is. This is where 85% of people in the world live. This is where most world trade will come within a generation. Yeah, and the largest developing country, the largest trader in the world today is China, a developing country. So from a development perspective, I'm going to make 4 points in the next 20 minutes. First is that autonomous trade reforms are by far the most effective form of trade policy, and their importance is increasing. That's my first point. The second point is that regional and bilateral agreements play a significant role in some instances, but their importance tends to be overestimated and is declining. The third point is that despite the well-known limitations of multilateral negotiations, the WTO remains a crucial institution at the core of world trade and is a vital development actor. It needs to find ways to move forward on its negotiating technology. That's the third point. The fourth point is that the prospects for success of mega-regionals are, in my mind, dubious. They could actually end up as a costly distraction from today's more important trade policy priority, which is to integrate developing countries. So these are my 4 points. Let me elaborate a little bit. First of all, why do I put such emphasis on autonomous trade reforms? Well, part of the reason is that I see modern development as learning, absorbing techniques from the state of the art. This is the only way, as Bob Lucas once wrote, to understand why developing countries are able to grow so fast. And of course, trade is important for many other reasons, right? Ricardo, Adam Smith underscored the importance of specialization, economies of scale, comparative advantage, et cetera, et cetera. But more modern thinking about development really stresses the learning dimension, the capacity of countries to learn from each other, to import capital goods, to address the needs of the most demanding global customers, to compete with the best. All this is vital to technological improvement, progress in developing countries. One implication is that trade policy has to take a very broad view of itself. This is because there are many ways that countries learn from each other. Trade is not the only way. Foreign direct investment that you have mentioned, Colin has mentioned, is a very important way that countries learn from each other. And foreign direct investment is crucial because it exposes the non-traded sector to internationalization. And the non-traded sector, the service sector, is by far the largest sector of the economy still today. Migration, movement of workers, remittances, crucial way. And nowadays, you can get information for free on the internet. So connectivity is a very important aspect of trade policy. So connecting to the world today is most easily done through autonomous policies. And that's because a good trade policy today is a competitiveness policy, is about, first and foremost, the coordination of domestic actors and the connection between trade policy reform and domestic policy reforms. Now, in a relatively open world economy, trade agreements can certainly help move this process forward, but actually their effect is secondary to the domestic policy agenda. By the way, economists have long recognized that in trade policy, what is most important is what you do. They say, there's this famous line, what you do is what you get in trade policy. The World Bank, where I used to work, has shown that autonomous trade liberalization has quantitatively been by far the most important source of liberalization, much more important than regional multilateral or multilateral deals. Autonomous reforms, which are nearly always practice MFN, they apply to everybody, affect immediately the whole economy, exposing it to the world, as distinct from negotiated trade agreements, which are partial, discriminatory, piecemeal, and negotiated and implemented over many years, as Colin and Roberto are very well aware of. 60 or 80 years ago, when tariffs were many times what they are today and large parts of the world market were off limits, negotiated reciprocal liberalization was much more important to obtain the gains from trade than it is today. And although trade negotiations can tilt the political economy of reforms, make it easier to get reforms because you trade off the interests of exporters for importers, etc. That's in theory true, but in practice it takes so long to negotiate these agreements. The gains are so distant, etc., that the reality is that countries that are really serious about opening up their economy to attract foreign investment, to improve their trade logistics, just go ahead and do it. I like to call it the Nike trade policy. And by the way, this has been, despite the eloquent exposition of Peng, this has been very much the style in East Asia, right? They just went ahead and do it. They did the Nike trade policy. A lot of this stuff, complicated as it was, etc., is actually at the margins of what's really going on in Asia, which is a tremendous competition of the individual nations in making themselves more attractive for investment and quicker, faster, easier to do business in. That's where the real competition is. The trade negotiations are a secondary factor. Okay, so that's my first point. It's actually my most important point. I could almost stop here. Let me say a word about regional agreements. I'll talk about mega regionals at the end. So supposedly the big attraction of bilateral and regional agreements, of which there are now some 400 plus and counting, is that in contrast to autonomous policy reform, they offer the possibility of a reciprocal concession in market access. And moreover, in contrast to multilateral deals, they do so in a relatively simple context, negotiated with one or two trading partners. Also, bilateral and regional agreements are assumed to be so attractive because they are preferential. They give a country a leg up on its competitors. In practice, however, when you actually examine what is the average preference margin in regional trade agreements, it's about 1% today. And so preferences actually matter in only a few sectors. Of course, these preference margins were bigger 30 years ago, 40 years ago. But the preferences today matter in only a few sectors, such as garments or agriculture, where tariffs tend to be high. Moreover, these preference margins are tending to erode continuously as more and more preferential agreements are negotiated. Yeah? If I make a preferential agreement with you, you get a preference. If I make a preferential agreement with everybody, nobody has a preference. Okay? That's part of what's going on. And of course, the multilateral liberalization has helped too. In theory, bilateral and regionals also offer the opportunity for deep integration and removal of non-tariff barriers of various kinds. In practice, this has been very difficult to achieve, even within the EU, which has gone furthest than other countries. Indeed, as I was very interested by the comment on Canada, actually, Colin, your relationship between the international and the domestic. Because I like to make the point when people say to me, well, you know, these non-tariff barriers, we're going to eliminate the non-tariff barriers, is that last year I moved from Potomac to DC, 10 miles, okay? I had to redo my driver's license, my car registration. I had to do an emission test, even though I had done it a few weeks before, because DC does not recognize. All right, so, you know, we have to have a sense of reality. In addition, there's a lot more carving out of sensitive areas in these agreements than we like to recognize. For example, Colin mentioned just very in passing that we've had this very ambitious agreement between the U.S., between Canada and the EU, but we did leave out agriculture. It's actually 98%, largely left out agriculture. But in fact, agriculture is where the real action is.
7% of tariff line.
What?
7% of tariff.
All right, but agriculture, a lot of those lines is where the real action is a lot of the time. And remember, I'm talking from a development perspective. And despite all these shortcomings, bilateral and regional agreements retain their popularity, as has been clear today. And partly there are these residual preferences in sensitive sectors that we go for. But quite a few people, and I tend to be among them, believe that a very important reason why RTAs are so attractive is not so much because of their economic significance, but because trade agreements have become part and parcel of foreign policy, a way of consolidating alliances, influence, and strengthening national security. And this may explain why the potentially most important trade agreements in the world that we could strike, for example, between the US and China, or the EU and China, or the US and Brazil, or with India, or the EU with India, etc., or with Brazil, are either not on the table at all, or are on the table but are struggling. Okay? Now, a word about the WTO. So what is the role of this multilateral system? This is an agreement among 160 countries. It's a nightmare of an agreement. Yet I view its role as fundamental for development. Not because I see the WTO as a powerful force for future trade liberalization. And certainly I do not see it as a source of the broad and deep trade reform that enhance learning from development. That's not the reason I see the WTO as central. In fact, I'm very aware and have written that the WTO hasn't produced a multilateral trade agreement in the 20 years since its inception. The GATT had its predecessor, had quite a lot of success in multilateral reduction of tariffs, but it actually did very little in a lot of the other areas of trade policy, services, foreign investment, movement of workers, and so on. The Doha agenda, in my view, is dead, but the only reason it has not been pronounced dead is because the WTO operates by consensus, and several important members want to continue to have Doha on life support as a hostage to ensure that their agenda is not ignored. So I just want to underscore, I understand the issues, the difficulties in the WTO today. The reason I consider it so critical for development is, of course, that it provides a system of rules that makes world trade much more predictable. It's an inadequate and incomplete system of rules, but it covers a set of activities without which the world's increasingly integrated production structure cannot function. Uniquely in international relations, the WTO provides a reasonably effective system to settle disputes and a formalized way of exercising sanctions against violators without resorting to the alternative, which is outright embargo or war. This is why when the Berlin Wall came down, the WTO provided an anchor for the formally planned economies and many developing countries, about 34 in total with 2 billion or so population, countries that had cultivated autarkic state-driven economies to become integrated into global markets and effectively adopt market capitalism and the rule of law in international commercial transactions. This is probably the single most important advance in global governance of the last, anyway, the period that I can remember since perhaps 1945. The importance, according to the WTO as an institution, is best understood by considering that China and Russia, world powers, underwent an accession process lasting over 10 years under which they agreed to disciplines significantly more demanding than those accepted by incumbents in the WTO. There is an interesting question as to why it is difficult to imagine world trade functioning without a WTO or equivalent, yet FDI, portfolio and banking flows, and migration flows seem to grow without anything resembling the WTO that governs them. It's a complex question, but let me just say here that actually migration, international migration, is a mess. It is a source of widespread human abuse, and it is governed by the law of the jungle. That is the reality in migration. The banking sector and capital flows, in general, have been growing, but they have also been the source of dozens of crises in the post-war period. Foreign direct investment is interesting because it has prospered, absent any multilateral agreement on investment, and has generated enormous benefits for both origin and destination countries. But FDI is special because it has the advantage of being actively sought by countries. Many countries actually subsidize foreign inward direct investment, and they are encouraged, FDI is encouraged because countries compete for it all the time. And so this is a situation where country policies are subject to a considerable degree to the law of the market. Okay, final point in the 4 minutes. Mega regionals. What is their role? We haven't said it. Mega regions are special, okay? They're not other regional agreements. They're big. They span more than one of the world's regions. As you have heard from our colleagues here, they aim explicitly to rewrite the trade rules for the 21st century. This effectively appropriates the role of the WTO in a vital area. So the mega regionals can actually be seen as a hybrid of regional arrangements and the WTO, except that they exclude China, India, Indonesia, Brazil, and so on, the fastest growing parts of world trade and those that will dominate world trade within a generation. Mega regionals are special in a couple of ways, which is very interesting, but also is going to make it very, very difficult to reach deals. They're special because tariff reduction, while it is part of the negotiations, is not the main part of the negotiations. This means that developing countries generally are going to be less worried by the trade diverting effects of these agreements compared to standard regionals. The main focus of these mega regionals is in the reduction of non-trade barriers, different regulations that make the playing field uneven for firms in various areas, and, as Roberto has underlined, the adoption of more demanding, clearer, and more predictable rules for conducting trade and investment. He's mentioned them. So in effect, if you're outside the mega regionals, you're not so worried about the discrimination that comes from reduction in tariff barriers because the barriers are low in the first place. What you do worry about, and perhaps this is a positive thing, is that your own investment climate is going to become less attractive than the countries that are inside the mega regionals because they adopt common rules, they adopt common standards, et cetera, et cetera. But it's correct. I mean, nobody stops you from sort of watching what they're doing and adjusting. From a development perspective, I'm not going to go in there now. It's actually not as simple as that, because if you guys adopt really fancy standards, it's not so easy for developing countries to have the same standards. Also, there are areas like intellectual property rights where there's a fundamental difference of interest, okay? Advanced countries have every possible interest in protecting, for a while, their innovators. Developing countries have a much more important interest in adapting those, because they're not the primary source of innovation, at least not yet. They can change in the future. So there are discriminatory issues, but by and large, I don't see them as fundamental. And in some ways, I see them as positive. So I'm less worried about that. I'm much more worried about, will the mega regionals actually succeed? And here I underscore two big sources of vulnerability. The first is that negotiating common standards is a lot more complicated than negotiating tariff reductions. And it's also very easy to paper over differences, creative use of language, et cetera, et cetera. If you didn't agree on reducing the Japanese tariff on rice to 0, everybody knows about it. If you didn't succeed in agreeing a common standard on how to wash chicken, there's all sorts of ways of expressing that, and, et cetera. The second weakness, potential weakness in the mega region, it's not clear to me that the political commitment exists that is commensurate with the enormous complexities of trying to negotiate these common standards. This particularly so in the TTIP, by the way. I'm less concerned about the TPP. Many reasons we can talk about. I don't really need to belabor that point. This is a country, the United States, which is already relatively open. Okay, it's at the center of the agreements. It doesn't have that much to give in return. In fact, this is one of my critiques of the mega regionals. It actually doesn't ask the United States to do very much. So if it doesn't ask the United States to do very much, as an economist, as a trade economist, I become very suspicious, because I say, well, where are the gains then? Why are the gains so big for the United States? If it's all overseas, the gains are bound to be small, and in fact, that's what these models suggest, is that the gains are going to be small. But more importantly, the political economy becomes much more complicated if the key actor doesn't have much to give, or what it has to give, like, for example, tariffs on trucks, or tariffs on sugar, or changing its sugar regime, is politically very, very complicated. So that's why I am doubtful that the mega regionals are going to give us very much. Yet at the same time, the mega regionals are diverting attention from what is really the priority, should be the priority area in world trade today, which is to deal with the big issues associated with developing countries. So I'd like to see much more effort on reduction of tariff barriers in Brazil, in India, in Indonesia. I would like to see much more emphasis on agricultural reforms. I'd like to see much more emphasis on the elimination of agricultural subsidies, particularly today at the time when countries in the advanced countries are enormously strapped for cash. I would like to see more emphasis on movement of workers, and especially so better legislation of movement of workers from the south to the north, migration reforms. So a last word is how should the WTO respond to the mega-regionals? The WTO, of course, is only an agglomeration of its members acting in a multilateral context. It's a member-driven organization. There is, in my view, no realistic prospect of multilateralizing regional arrangements, and especially not the mega-regionals. I don't think the political will exists for that, and I don't think the negotiating technology exists to multilateralize regional agreements or disciplines achieved in the mega-regionals. I think that's a pipe dream. The natural way forward for the WTO, in addition to continuing the very crucial role it plays today in disputes, trade policy reviews, accession, technical assistance, etc., is to convince its largest and most influential members that plurilateral agreements in specific areas should be allowed to move forward, whether they are of the MFN variety, that is, they apply to everybody, even those who do not negotiate the agreement, or they are of the non-MFN variety, provided that a critical mass of members want them. Thank you. I'm sorry I exceeded my time.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you. We have a variety of different approaches and perspectives here. Various states, political, economic, geopolitical. Colin has to leave because he, being the diplomat here, has multiple other engagements. So I'm going to take 2-3 questions at the beginning. If you have a specific question related to CETA, please put your hand up right now, and I'll have Colin at least address 1 or 2 questions. Thank you for all of the panelists who gave very diverse perspectives.
Thank you. I am a third-year law student at American University. And I've been looking over some of the CETA publications, and I noticed that it was very specific to exclude IPRs from the investment portion of the treaty, while focusing very clearly on pharmaceutical patent extensions within the intellectual property portion. But it didn't mention at all the IPRs that actually define whether or not a particular drug is going to get a patent within the country. So whereas Canada has the doctrine of sound prediction, and whereas the European Union tends to be more restrictive on patenting anything that comes from human research or human genetic research, that doesn't seem to be addressed in these agreements. And I was wondering if the trade agreements are not seen as a way of perhaps harmonizing the diverging international approaches to patenting various drugs and pharmaceuticals, or if it's just something that is seen as too difficult to address right now.
And can we take 1 second question so that Colin, and particularly if it's Canada. Okay, thank you.
Do you think that TTIP and these other future agreements will have any effect on the standards within CETA? And if so, is there a mechanism in CETA to incorporate these changing standards?
So I'll start with IP. There's certainly the international structure of agreements and standards around intellectual property are designed to provide a certain amount of flexibility to each sovereign to make the balance that feels appropriate. And I think CETA is no exception in that regard. And so, there are certainly issues that are delicate on both sides of the EU-Canada line in terms of intellectual property. At the end of the day, what you get in, I think there was what you see on the copyright side is some real movement in Canada over the last, since 2012, in terms of how we do copyright. You see in the CETA the move on patent extension that I think was a significant issue for the EU and their pharmaceutical industry. At the end of the day, these are always going to be finely determined balances that come out, and this is where we came out. In terms of how a TTIP is going to potentially influence the CETA, we certainly did provide in the rules of origin area provisions that would allow, particularly on autos, a process of conversation that would occur if there was a TTIP put in place to make those rules of origin more global. So there is there's a lot of thinking also from the Canadian side going into the CETA about how to preserve this very special trade relationship that Canada and the U.S. has, and make sure that was not in any way damaged. And I think if you do get a TTIP, and I think we're a few years out still, not to second guess the speed of our negotiators on the other side, then we'll have to see where we come out at that point. But I would imagine that there would be another round of conversations about CETA at that point.
Thank you. And we're going to open for a couple more questions because Colin has to leave. Peck is also going to actually teach, but she'll be back as well this afternoon. So if anybody would like to raise any additional questions to the panel, please do so, and particularly to Peck. And if you want to tweet, please do so. If you have a question in your live streaming, please send it to singlemarket@american.edu. You can tell where we stand on this. Any questions, please?
Sorry.
Here
I
it
guess
is.
my question. Thank you. My question is for everybody in general. Mr. Pena mentioned that multilaterals take time to negotiate, and then Mr. Dedish mentioned that there's a lack of political will to really come to an agreement on certain standards. And I was wondering, given the elections coming up next year and the recent change in the House and the Senate and the potential change for the country to completely switch political sides, whether anybody had any concerns as to that impact on the multilateral system, considering the U.S.'s strong presence in the WTO.
Can I just quickly, as we're answering your question, I'd like to highlight a couple of points that you made. What we're seeing in the RCEP trade liberalization model is this autonomous. It's really, the autonomous trade reform, and each country moving to reform at its own pace, and that's the only way you can get anything done. And ultimately, it does lead to greater trade flows in the region. And also, the point about the political will, and the point that in the TTP negotiations, which is why a number of countries in China is extremely frustrated by this, and India is not even, India can't because it's not a member of APEC at the moment, that there is, that the U.S. is not giving anything at the moment, period. And the U.S. negotiates separately with its 11 partners and the different market access provisions for the different ones. So U.S. is maximizing from its position and not giving much at all. So, and I think that's why we have 19 rounds, and there's still a number of issues that are not resolved yet, and we don't know, ultimately whether, but the smaller, like Malaysia, which I've looked at very carefully, the leader Najib wants to go into TPP because he wants to get into the U.S. market. Malaysia is so trade dependent; it has to, to increase its exports and it's now losing its competitiveness in terms of labor costs, and of course exploiting foreign labor as a result of it. So, but there's so much domestic opposition to the way the U.S. is demanding that Malaysia and Vietnam, accede to what the U.S. wants and not giving much in return. So, but for Joe, for strategic reasons, political reasons, Malaysia may finally agree to do it, but it's still a big question mark as to whether it will actually do it. So that the lack of political will, and China has no political will, Indonesia has no political will, to want to even look at the TPP, which is why you've got an alternative path. An alternative path in RCEP is actually a better, a more suitable way of doing trade liberalization in the region.
Would you like to respond to any of the questions?
Can you restate your question? I wasn't clear, actually, what your question was there at the back. Yeah.
My question was really, if the U.S. becomes a Republican country again, do you have any concerns about the effects of that on trade negotiations in the future? And because the U.S. is such a strong force in the trade world, and it's such a, it has a lot of influence on other countries. If you had any concerns about the effects on the multilateral trade system because of that.
Right. Okay. Well, the United States may have a Republican majority in the Congress, and there may even be a Republican administration at some point. That doesn't make the United States a Republican country. It's still a democracy. But anyway, I actually personally don't see Republicans as being the more opposed to trade. If anything, it's to trade policy reforms. If anything, it's the other way. The Democrats are typically have a much bigger concern about the effects, correct or otherwise, on jobs and income inequality, et cetera, et cetera. The Republicans tend to have more of a business orientation. Yeah, the Chamber of Commerce that is very active in the U.S. Chamber of Commerce that is very active in lobbying for trade negotiations, primarily in the last election supported Republican candidates, not exclusively, but primarily. So I see trade, as do quite a few other people in town, as one of the areas where the Republicans, Congress, and the White House, the Democratic White House, could collaborate, could find a meeting point, so as to support Trade Promotion Authority, which I believe is absolutely critical to move forward on whether you look at TPP. I'm getting very worried because there's nobody on the panel now, so we're going to have to answer all the questions.
I know.
Roberto and I.
Will help.
All right. I'm not sure that I know all the answers. Maybe Roberto does. Yeah. Go ahead.
But tying it back to I think you had asked about the multilateral discussions that are taking place. U.S. negotiators, just as EU negotiators, have to go back home and consult with their respective legislatures. We have to engage closely with the Council on the multilateral negotiation front and the state of play in different negotiations. So political change. We also had a political changeover at the European Union as well, but the civil service is still there. The trade negotiating agencies are still active. And if you look at specifically the customs and trade facilitation discussions, I think there's a recognition. I would think among both political parties in the U.S. that it's a very good area to promote and to advance the discussions, and in the EU it's the same. Same with trade and environmental goods as well, and the TISA negotiations. So a political transition wouldn't necessarily totally change our outward position.
Hello, I have a question for Mr. Pena. I was curious if you could shed some light on an issue, the ISDS issue again. Particularly in Germany, there's been a lot of press on a particular case called Vattenfall, a water company a Swedish company that provided services in Berlin, and then Berlin changed some kind of regulation, and there was a lawsuit, and the company was compensated, and this has been thrown out as a reason to not have ISDS, that it will actually lead to public health rules and all kinds of public regulations being struck down through the system. And I was just curious, what is the EU's response very concretely to those types of examples that are out there in the public debate?
Sure. Well, you may not like my answer, but we're not formally a part of that respective ISDS case, and I don't believe the full details of the dispute are public. So I'm unable to comment on the merits of the particular case. So I'm speaking about it in the abstract. I'll speak about it in the abstract. So what I have heard is that it's an example of a company trying to reverse a government's regulation in the public interest. But you can also see it as a company wanting to engage with the government to discuss what are the aspects about a concession contract that they had in place. And so again, I don't know the details of that particular case, but if you're a foreign company and you sign a contract with the government to provide a service for X amount of years, in the middle of the contract, the government decides to change a policy that invalidates the contract. I mean, in the U.S., in the EU, there's across many jurisdictions, I would think in most parts of the world, there is recourse for you to go to court and to try to sort out how that needs to be handled, and if you're given due process, if you can challenge, and if they've clearly explained why they're doing it, and if it's deemed to be expropriation. Again, I'm speaking in the abstract, so not about this case. But if it seemed to be an expropriation, here you have the takings clause in the U.S. Constitution. So if the government does expropriate your property, there is just compensation. So I think we need to be reminded as to the reason why the protections are out there, and they're to provide the foreign companies with recourse in the event of these expropriation questions taking place, or in the case of a contract being not able to be fulfilled. So again, don't know the particular details of this case, but I think that would be my counter argument to say we don't know the full details. Sometimes, you look at Germany and you say there's no issue with their legal system, but if you're dealing with a third country, you don't know that foreign investors aren't necessarily getting a fair hearing, getting their day in court necessarily, and so you have this mechanism out there in the event that you do face the discrimination. You can go to a neutral tribunal.
This is a very good, Roberto's logic is very tight. and correct. Okay, I mean, you're a company. You based yourself on a contract. Contract changes because of political decisions. You want to have recourse. The devil is a little bit in the details from a development perspective. And it's this. Roberto said, there's no problem with the German legal system, okay? But it's interesting because the negotiation is actually between the EU and the US. So where is the problem with the legal system? Is it in the US? Is it in Kansas? Is it in Brussels? Where is the problem? Well, the answer is, well, we trust the legal system of the European countries and the United States. But it's actually about third countries. That's why we are establishing the ISDS. And this is part of the tension here, because the third countries are not actually part of this negotiation, okay? They're not there. They're not able to express their views about this important question. And so these things really, if we're gonna sort of effectively impose them on third countries, now, you know, I say effectively because there's no legal way that this agreement is going to apply to India or to China. But the effectively relates to the fact that once this is agreed as a norm, and it's agreed by countries that represent, you know, half of world trade and have enormous geopolitical influence and military, you know, security capacity, et cetera, that over time this will actually be applied globally, okay? And I'm actually not necessarily saying the ISDS is a bad thing. I myself spent many years in the private sector. I know what it means to have a contract violated, including, you know, in a public context. I'm not saying necessarily it's a bad thing, but it is very divisive, and it is sort of the application of a way of thinking that might have been appropriate in the immediate post-war period, but nowadays with the developing countries playing such an important role, this is going to be resisted. And that's why I said there is no chance at all of this kind of stuff being applied in a WTO context in the current political economy situation.
And if I can just make one last point, what the EU has proposed and actually done in CETA is to incorporate greater safeguards and really clarify the right to regulate. It shouldn't be something that a company could just launch a case for. So it's for the you know, in the event you're discriminated against as a foreigner. And the first part of investment agreements sort of lay out what that expectation is in terms of fair and equitable treatment. And then the latter half of chapters typically go through what the dispute settlement process would do. And so that's.
So what you're saying is basically the public critique that it would lead to a chilling of regulation that would not.
Could you say the question again for the live stream?
Sorry, just so your response there, what you're saying is the strong public critique that it would lead to a sort of shutdown or chilling on regulators that really wouldn't be in effect.
I don't believe so, but I think governments would have to think, you know, is this policy that I'm implementing explicitly discriminatory to foreigners? If it's a policy that impacts everyone, domestic, foreign firms, the same, there shouldn't really be a discriminatory practice there. So I think that's something we should all strive for.
There were a number of issues raised in the panel. Any more questions? Absolutely. And I have just two more questions.
Hello. My question is regarding TTIP specifically, and if you foresee any political ramifications from the recent elections in Greece, considering the far left party has said they would veto TTIP altogether.
I have a follow-up to that. I'm Professor Nicola, and Rashna didn't introduce herself, is one of our WCL students who's also going to be in the team representing our school to litigate a case on European Union law rules, a moot court case. So based on the Greece anti-TTIP, my question was about whether regulatory cooperation, what are the cost benefits of regulatory cooperation? So Uri was, it's a lot of cost and ultimately it doesn't achieve much. In my experience teaching harmonization in the single market, what I've seen is that we did achieve a lot with harmonization, achieving similar standards, similar legislation, similar rule. I have to say that teaching comitology was very stressful, and now teaching regulatory mechanism or implemented act of delegated measures, regulatory processes in the EU is much better after Lisbon, and I think a push has come from TTIP to streamline the regulatory work of the Union in a more clear and transparent way. But on the other hand, the cost of this, there is a cost. There is a cost for countries such as Greece, Italy, and they have less agile administration. And on the one hand, the administration is becoming less corrupted, but on the other hand, there are burdens to change their processes in a way that is, you could call it more based on notice and comment to rulemaking, the US style, which is not necessarily the most transparent, I think, but certainly more open to lobbies. There's also a cost of implementing these harmonized procedures that is costly for countries such as Greece, where, for instance, environmental norms cost much more than in Germany and Denmark. So a specific issue was in the impact assessments that we're requiring now for regulation in both countries. Is there like an impact that TTIP will create for developing countries? An international impact assessment that will tell us, okay, we're regulating on this, we're standardizing this norm, but we're creating a huge cost for developing countries. And I was wondering if there's something of the sort.
Okay.
And I'm going to add to that for those in the audience. Just let me ask the question, what's new, what's different? We've been trying this for 20, 30 years to deal with regulatory barriers, non-tariff barriers, both bilaterally and in other contexts. So what's new, what's different? What can TTIP or others provide us with that we haven't tried already? Mutual recognition, harmonization, equivalence. We heard all this from Colin today in CETA. So it's really a question, my first question. The second one, I think Uri raised something very interesting today. Are countries engaging in trade agreements to promote domestic structural reform? And if that's the case, what domestic structural reform, given a single market in the EU and given a fairly integrated internal market in the United States, why are we doing it US-EU? Is it the ones that are more interesting are Korea or Japan or others which will engage in some really domestic structural reforms? Those are my questions. Thank you.
Okay. Wow, a lot of good but tough questions. Starting with the first one, I guess what are the political ramifications of elections, and how could this potentially impact the TTIP? I would say that the challenge is for negotiators, EU and US, to bring back a solid agreement that people can rally behind. And something that actually establishes, for Europe, establishes better market access in the U.S. market for EU exporters, creates opportunities for small and medium-sized enterprises. So it's really about coming back with a deal that people can rally behind. And things are said things are said during elections, but at the same time, when you govern and you see that Greece is a part of a 28 country economic bloc and the potential gains that are in a TTIP deal for Greece, if we can come back with a strong agreement that actually creates value for Greece, then I think it's something that any politician would be in a position to back. And then I guess we'll tackle the other question. But did you have anything to add to the?
On Greece? No, not particularly. No, I mean it's there's a long history of kind of, let's call it, non-mainstream parties having very strong statements, platforms, etc. But then once they get into power, things change. And so I'd like to start addressing the questions on Greece. There's some very important questions that go beyond TTIP, let's be very frank, about how they will deal with their massive debt and what their attitude is going to be with respect to the various programs of support that and the conditions attached thereto from Brussels and Frankfurt and Washington. Those are going to be, the most salient issues. And I'd like to come back to this question 3 months from now and see how the Syriza and Mr. Tsipras are adapting to the new reality of having power. I'll stop there. I could go on. I'll stop there. Yeah.
On the other question on the value of regulatory cooperation, I would say that there's a significant cost in time savings and paperwork, red tape savings. And I just wanted to link, I guess, some of our comments and what we have in common and what we've been saying. It's about governance. And developing countries, I would say, are trying to improve their business climate. I mean, a lot of them look very closely to these doing business reports and trying to streamline the red tape of starting a company and what's their regulatory burden. So that's of mutual benefit, and in some ways, if hope I'm not misspeaking, but it's a way that countries signal to foreign investors that they're open for business, and so that tends to attract investment. But coming back to the value of regulatory cooperation, certainly in fostering better cooperation, and you'd be surprised. In being involved in the TTIP discussions and these sectoral discussions that are taking place, there's different agencies cooperate at a different level. Some share information, some don't. So it's really interesting to bring the two parties together and see how they could, in some cases it might be a first introduction, or how can we build off of our existing cooperation mechanisms. Maybe talking once a year isn't good enough. I mean, if there's a future comprehensive reform taking place, can we flag that to the other side and explain what's happening and in a cooperative manner? But there have been economic analyses to try to estimate the cost. The independent study that the European Union commissioned on the TTIP, that actually looked at a different set of scenarios. And so one looked at, I believe it was virtually full harmonization, right, which is difficult to envision, but they also offer, and they provide a specific estimate for that. But then they have different levels of reconciling non-tariff barriers that reflect in the estimated values. But I think an ambitious TTIP with a regulatory component, I think it was about a 0.5% of GDP to both sides with a strong regulatory component, but stopping short of modeling a full harmonization, which I mean in the real world that's probably not what's going to take place. The other thing to flag for you and to remind is because you've taught on comitology in terms of the EU rulemaking process. Oftentimes the EU issues a policy directive, in which case the member states in turn, based on their legal regimes, based on their institutions, are tasked with incorporating into their domestic system. And so through the EU directives process, it allows each member state to implement relative to their legal and regulatory systems. So we found I think a good accommodation that takes into account all the diversity of the member states. In looking ahead to the TTIP, I would say that this, adding transparency to the regulatory process, that I think that's good. I think for both sides. I think, and just clarifying it to people, the U.S. has their notice and comment system. It's very structured. The EU has its own system where we're transparent in our rulemaking process. It's slightly different. I mean, in our view, it's just as transparent, but how can we square that circle? And I think that's kind of the centerpiece of the discussions in that particular area.
Yeah, let me just add that harmonization from the point of view of developing countries, any standard that is agreed among the US and EU is likely to be a high standard. That is indeed the relatively high standard. That is indeed the objective of the declared objective of the negotiations. That will have a disproportionately higher cost for countries that have weak execution capacity, regulatory capacity, as you yourself, Professor Nicola, have mentioned when you talked about Italy or Greece. So that's true. The second is that the cost is likely to be higher if for excluded countries if it's harmonization rather than mutual recognition. If it's mutual recognition, there are two standards, right? And so Malaysia or China or India may already be exporting to the US and EU and used to both standards. They don't actually have to adjust their standards if there is mutual recognition. Which, by the way, I mean, I would assume is going to be a lot easier to do than harmonization. Harmonization is much more complicated. The third point I want to make on this is that the rhetoric matters. It isn't just what is on the paper, but it's the way that is presented. How can I say this? We are no longer in a world where the United States can say, or the EU can say, this is our agreement, this is our template, take it or leave it. My friend who is a diplomat will say, oh no, we would never do that. The diplomats and the trade negotiators that I talk to in developing countries all systematically say that's the way it works. They come with their template and they say, this is it, Hey, we got a $15 trillion GDP here we're talking about. And what are you? You're a $50 billion nothing. In terms of market. What do you really want us to adjust and look at the complications we have back home to get anything done? Get it through the US Congress, you must be joking. Et cetera, et cetera. That has been the reality of a lot of these bilateral negotiations that have been going on many years between the EU and developing countries, between the US and developing countries. The tinkering is very much at the margin. And it's very much about what the developing country will do at the margin. On the other hand, the quid pro quo, to be fair, the quid pro quo is very significant because you're giving them access to the largest market in the world. Not giving them access because in practice you're giving them access at the margin because the access is already open to a large degree. And the reason I say the rhetoric matters is we're no longer in that kind of world politically. So when the US and EU negotiate with each other and then say to the world, which even President Obama said in his Trade of the Union speech, Michael Froman repeats it all the time, we are going to set the standards for the global trade for the 21st century. That's what we're doing. That kind of worked reasonably well 30 years ago. It doesn't work well now. It gets a lot of people's backs up. And so even if you can argue that in some instances the cost is relatively small, there's going to be a very strong reaction against that. It creates a lot of tension and a lot of ill will. One last point I want to make to those who want to underplay the political aspect of these discussions. The triggering factor in the crisis in Ukraine, the triggering factor, not the underlying factor, but the triggering factor in the crisis of Ukraine was an open competition between two trade agreements, the one that Russia wanted to attract Ukraine into, and the one that the EU wanted to attract Ukraine into. This is not to say let's not do trade agreements for political reasons. This is not to say that the trade agreement between the Ukraine and the EU didn't make sense. It's just to underscore the tremendous sensitivities of these types of issues and these types of approaches in a world which has become much more multipolar.
If I can just add one thing I did forget to mention that's pretty innovative in terms of what the EU does when it does impact assessments of actual trade agreements. It actually does an impact assessment on the effect on the partner country. And so the EU goes to great lengths to try to ensure that it's a mutually beneficial arrangement. In terms of the TTIP, in this independent study, that there was also an impact assessment on the global economy. External from the EU and the US, what the potential impact would be, and the study found that there would be a substantial benefit to the global economy in terms of the increased trade, and I mean through these supply chain linkages. I mean you would assume that also third countries are also sourcing products, and so it could lead to just a larger overall increase in global trade, which has a positive impact. And the other component, if you look at the customs and trade facilitation discussions that are taking place, a big part of that is dealing with what is the ability of different developing countries to potentially implement these changes. So that, I mean, these things are being discussed in real time right now, and so there is a sensitivity to that on the part of the EU. The other is that incorporated in it, I believe that there's also capacity building commitments for the developing countries that are going to be implementing. So I mean, it may not be. I mean, it may not be sufficient, but I think we're in a sort of a new reality. I didn't agree with everything you said, but I do think I think the EU and the US, I think, are more cognizant of a lot of these sensitivities and the potential impacts on the developing countries, and it isn't viewed as sort of an imposition of take it or leave it. This is what we do. It's more of how can we work together? Can this be mutually beneficial? But yeah.
Michelle, your questions, we didn't answer.
Yeah, yeah.
That's, you can take that as the last question, and I just want to make sure if you are tweeting or you're live streaming, please send email at singlemarket@american.edu. And for those of you who want to stay after the last final two questions or the final two answers, please do stay, take a bathroom break, and we are actually waiting for the food to arrive. I'm assuming that it is the weather, not anything else. So we're waiting for the food, and then we have a fantastic panel, so it'll give you 5-10 minutes to stretch before the next one. But if you want to take the final the final question that I asked.
The one question was about what's new on standards. What was the
What's
second
new?
question?
What's different? I feel like I'm in a time warp. For anybody who's studied transatlantic trade relations or regulatory cooperation or mutual recognition, for everybody who's been there in the 1992 single market, this process is not easy. What makes us think that we're actually going to reap dividends?
What was the other question you had?
The other question was about domestic structural adjustment. Is this really, you asked a very important impact, not really the Nike effect, but here, is it more important that we have these trade agreements, less for the US and the EU, but for domestic structural adjustment for China, for Korea, for Japan, to open up some very closed markets? Is this giving them the political room to do so?
Shall I go first? So very quickly on what's new in terms of these agreements and regulation. In theory, what is new is that you can trade off one sector for another. Yeah? By dealing with all of them together, you can trade off one thing for another. And I say this in theory as somebody who grew up in kind of studying trade policy, because that's what my professors told me when I was very young. And so I kind of carried it with me. But then when I actually got into the reality of sort of watching and being part, in some ways, of these negotiations, what I realized is that it actually doesn't work that way, because when you have such a broad agenda, the ability that you have to deal with things together rather than sequentially, and to trade off one against the other, is extremely limited. And in fact, it can actually lead, and does lead, to breakdown instead of progress. Very simply because there's some, strong political interest that is objecting to one part of the agreement, and that is stopping everything else. And that's one way to interpret what has been happening in the Doha process. So if you ask me what's new, that's what's new, but I'm not sure that it actually is going to be particularly helpful, and that it is a more likely way to give results than to let each sector proceed on their own and encourage them in some low-key sort of way to move forward and execute the trade-offs within the specific sector, be it automotive or be it agricultural standards. So that's my view. On the trade agreements as an encouragement for structural reforms, yes, they can be an encouragement to structural reforms if they're real and if they're big. So the best example is China's accession to the WTO. That's the kind of world-class example. Was used very explicitly by the Chinese authorities to effect major changes and major structural reforms in the Chinese economy, and as a guide for that, and it was very successful in that respect. What was unique about that situation was that it was a very real thing. This was access to the global market by a country that saw itself as being the most important trading country in the 21st century. That was very real. The problem is, of course, with TTIP and TTIP, is that, there are very few developing countries that are part of them. So how are these? It actually is going the opposite direction. I mean, and some of the big developing countries that are part of TTIP or TPP, none in TTIP, at least not formally, in TPP, so you include Mexico, but Mexico has already done a lot as part of NAFTA, et cetera, et cetera. So the ones that are really going to be affected are Malaysia and Thailand, okay? And here we go back to the point that Peng made and I made as well, which is what are they really getting in return? You know, how much are they getting in return from these agreements? I think in the case of the EU and US, potentially, you know, given the size of their trade flows, you know, the incentive for structural reform is potentially there in terms of potentially the dollars and cents. But then you are confronting enormous coordination problems within the US and within Europe, and also a mentality of negotiators that is very independent. That there's a long history of you know, when they are negotiating, of saying this is the way it is, you know, and now they have to compromise. And some of the people that have to compromise are very, very powerful. So that's why the Federal Reserve and the U.S. Treasury have basically taken the position: we're not going to do we don't want to engage in revising our banking and financial regulations in consonance with whatever it is that Brussels has in mind in the negotiation. We're not interested in that. We've thought very carefully about this. We've got our own reasons for having these kinds of financial regulations. It's not to protect, it's to protect the consumer against financial crisis, and we don't want to mess around with that. You know, no, they may be wrong, they may be right, but they're very powerful players.
And the final comment from Roberto, and
Yeah.
if you
Yeah, go
haven't found a project for your semester course at this point from the first session this morning, then I'm sure there were plenty.
Yeah, thank you. So what's new and what's different? I would say that this time it's a part of a larger package. It's again the largest trade agreement that's ever been done. I think the EU is always quick to emphasize that what we really seek is to enhance the level of cooperation with U.S. regulators. So not an acceptance of the rules of the road in Europe or the ability of a U.S. exporter to just send something to a domestic market here and then just send it to the port to ship off to Europe with the same standards and abiding by the same regulations. That may not be the end result per se. I mean, we are still in early days, so it's hard to prejudge what it will look like. So I keep saying that the EU wants to emphasize just cooperation. That just you'd be surprised how often it just doesn't take place. With respect to financial services, I don't think it was. I don't believe it's an attempt by the EU to roll back regulations that they don't like. It's more of ensuring that regulators always take into account the international implications of their rules. Both sides have their strict mandates, the legislative mandates as well, that are clear in what rules they have to implement. But if there's sort of a reflex of saying, well, how's this going to impact Europe? Maybe I should pick up the phone and call and let them know what we're thinking. What are they thinking? It's more of a process that we want to encourage. So it's hard to say where it will be at the tail end. So that's what's new and what's different. And if you look at what the U.S. did with Canada and Mexico, they established a regulatory cooperation council that sets up these work streams that in different sectors that have targeted objectives in which they work towards, because not every regulatory or standards difference could be reconciled within the time frame of a trade agreement. That's why we emphasize the process. And so moving forward, will the regulators come together and exchange information and offer each other previews of their upcoming reforms? And let's see, in terms of domestic structural reforms, certain. I mean, were you asking with third countries?
Mostly for Uri because of the development perspective.
Yeah, and I go back to the governance point that a lot of developing countries, I think they do see value in offering kind of a predictable set of rules and a treatment to foreign investors in order to encourage that investment.
I want to thank everybody, and particularly the panelists today. We had Colin Bird, who gave us a really bird's eye view. No pun intended, Colin, from the Canadian Embassy, from CETA and how difficult it was. Peck, the really noodle bowl perspective in geopolitics of Asian free trade agreements, multiple. Roberto for TTIP and the progress and difficulties and governance issues, and Uri for reminding us that the development perspective in the WTO still matters. I think we covered much, much more. If you've been in town long enough, as I have, you'll know that we're very siloed. We have TTIP events, we have CETA events, we have TPP events, and we have occasionally development events and development trade economic events, but rarely do we bring them all together in one panel. So thank you very much. And please stay for our keynote and for a lunch. There is such thing as a free lunch.
Thank you.
It was a good discussion.
Because I've seen you at events, so I'm usually taking notes and listening. But no, it's very, you raise, I mean, we can't forget about the developing country implications.
Okay.
I mean, it should always be, factored into our policy-making decisions. So I agree with you. I was an emerging markets guy. I went to.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Where were you in emerging markets?
I studied Mexico and Central America, and I mean, obviously the ties to the U.S. market, but the political economic development trajectory.
So sorry, you what were you doing in? Are you from Mexico or?
No, I'm Salvadoran American.
Okay.
American, but I work
And
for
so
the European Union.
you work you work here.
Yeah, I'm a trade policy.
And so when you say you worked on emerging markets, how did you work? Where? In what context?
I worked in Mexico for the World Bank.
For the World Bank?
On governance, yeah.
Oh,
And,
I had
was
no
there in
idea.
2009.
Oh, okay,
Yeah,
okay.
so big,
Good.
challenges, but we were working with the agencies. Hi, how you doing?
I was wondering if you thought that the sort of cabinet investor trade disputes to exclude things like IPRs in the CETA agreement is going to be something that's seen more in TTIP or other.
Yeah. Well, I would say that's clarifying that. I mean, that's an issue that's been litigated in through several bilateral investment treaties, not only with Canada but in third countries. So the need to preserve the right, sort of take that possibility out of CETA, I think was of interest to both parties, because we don't want to be seen as compromised. You brought up the patent question. That's an inherently domestic exercise, so the EU and Canada wouldn't necessarily make a commitment to reform their patent system within a trade agreement. That's more of providing for the discretion of their domestic entities to do so. What it was trying to do was remove the possibility of potentially filing a case for this specific instance that we've seen a lot of case law on. So I think it's not necessarily a full carve out per se, but it's this specific challenge is to access to medicines.
So it's not going to be more attention to not a complete carve out of IPR?
No. Well, it depends. I mean, there potentially would be a separate IPR chapter that would deal with these questions. So investment is for an established investment necessarily. But if there's an IPR question, then you might defer to there's sort of a question about which chapter you would defer to in
I asked because there's an acknowledgement, not a declaration within CEDA to review the relationship of IPRs and the investment chapter 2 years.
Yeah, and it's in the investment chapter to establish the scope of these IPR questions for the IPR chapter itself. Not necessarily, because you have seen foreign investors trying to file ISDS cases related to their intellectual property. And so the appropriate avenue would be to go not use ISDS for these types of. I think that was the intent. Yeah. Hey, how are you? Oh. Yeah, it's a tough
interesting.
question.
Well, because I was in Germany this past year as a Robert Bosch Foundation Fellow and worked in the Bundestag and in the Foreign Office.
Probably had more intimate details than I
This
ever.
is a very big issue,
Certainly.
brought up by the Greens and then also pushed over into the European Parliament.
And you see, and you see how it veers on the right to regulate, and so there's the frustration. It's like, personally, it's within Germany's right to do, and more power to them. But if you're breaking a contract, that's sort of
No, I agree.
so I see it less as them trying to reverse the policy as opposed to, hey, you promised us 10 years and you're changing the policy after year 5. We made a substantial investment predicated on the 10 years. So, and I mean, it's not public, so you don't know what exactly they're saying, and so, but that's from my limited understanding of it.
No, it wasn't the financial.
But it does.
It's been
Oh yeah. Oh no. I'm familiar with the case. I'm familiar with the case. I mean, it's always mentioned, but as an EU official, it's not part of an EU treaty. It's Swedish Germany investment agreement question.
Overwhelmingly, the cases are European companies against other European member states.
It is.
A lot of them.
The reason why I raised it is because from my Germany this past year, there hasn't been an effective response from the national government.
Yeah.
This public critique. So that was kind of where I was at.
Yeah, and perhaps we tried to do the public. I don't know if you had a chance to look at the public consultation.
Yes.
But we said we came at it from a reformist perspective and saying, look, we get it. The system. There are a lot of accusations about the system. Here's a common accusation. Here's what we're trying to do with Canada. I mean, we put out the Canada chapter before it was even concluded, like with the investment chapter. We said, there's some, well, the U.S. has kind of learned, the U.S.
We will do so. We prepare the next panel. Yes, please. We're going to try to get started for the keynote because we're starting. So Jennifer, hello. How are you?
Michelle, did we do what you expected?
Oh, yes.
Okay, so I did pick up on all the ISDS. Okay, so hold on, let me just put these notes out.
I do not, however. Yeah, exactly. I don't have any PowerPoints or any of that, so.
Oh, right, yes.
I'll sit by you here.
Oh, I see.
So we will read, and then we send it to people in Brussels.
I see.
Yeah, so it's a matter of just telling people they're welcome and listen at the same time. So we'll try to get back on the schedule. but I don't think people have come in from their breaks yet.
My throat was
Yeah.
dry. Yeah. If you all could take your seats, you can eat, have your sandwich while we work, no problem. But please invite your colleagues that are outside to come in too, so we don't get too far out of the schedule. Okay, that's short. All right. For that, you need to pay me. Yeah. Hi, good afternoon. My name is Aloysio Lima Campos. I'm an adjunct faculty from the Washington College of Law, and I'm glad to be here. This is a pleasure for me to introduce your keynote speaker today. But before we get into that, I just want to, I don't know if you had a chance to get this flyer outside. This is our Geneva program. Those of you interested in international trade and other smaller issues like intellectual property and other things, you're welcome to check the program. We're full for this year, Fernanda, right?
Geneva, not for teaching trade and diplomacy in Washington. That is still open.
Okay. I'll be teaching trade and diplomacy in the context of this program, and we're still open for that. But for the Geneva program it's full, yeah. So, but you still have a chance for next year if you want to come early and let us know. Okay. Now you owe me. Now to our issue today. We're going to talk about investor-state dispute settlement and what's so important about that. I will start off by saying that February of last year, I was invited by the Ministry of Commerce of South Africa and their Center for Conflict Resolution to participate in a seminar. This was a policy advisory group seminar, which brought together about 30 policymakers, scholars and civil society from Africa, Asia, Europe, North and South America to assess and broaden the debate on the implications of international investment agreements, including BITs, for development efforts in Africa. We heard a lot during this event about what's good and what's bad about ISDS. And there are, as you probably know by now, there are positive and negative perspectives on this issue. Some see it as an indispensable part of investment agreements, an important attraction point for investors, while others see it as a tool to interfere in domestic law and policy, as illustrated by the cigarette labeling case in Australia that you probably heard about, but you'll probably hear more about when Jennifer talks about it. I'm sure she's going to cover this. And recent concerns expressed by the governments of France and Germany with regards to ISDS as a result of that particular case. Also as illustrated by the recent trend away from BITs in Africa, Indonesia, Singapore, Latin America, which is also driven by similar concerns. In the case of Brazil, which I'm very familiar with, the law provides for national treatment of foreign direct investments. And that's the reason that BITs in Brazil with ISDS clauses are considered unconstitutional. Because under these bilateral investment treaties, foreign investors would receive preferential treatment in prejudice to the domestic investors. So 13 BITs have been signed in Brazil, but none has been ratified by Congress for that reason. So under this cloud of controversy, no one could be more prepared to shed light into this issue than our keynote speaker today. Sitting to my right, Jennifer Hillman. She dispenses any introduction, but I will do my job here as best as I can. She has had a distinguished career in public service, both nationally and internationally. She recently completed her term as one of 7 members serving the World Trade Organization's appellate body. Prior to that, she served for 9 years as a commissioner at the United States International Trade Commission, rendering decisions in more than 600 investigations regarding injury to U.S. industries caused by imports that were either dumped or subsidized, along with making numerous decisions in cases involving alleged patent and trademark infringement. Before her appointment to the U.S. ITC, she served as General Counsel at the Office of United States Trade Representative, where she had previously been an ambassador and chief textiles negotiator. We probably met during that time, yeah. Prior to accepting that position, she served as legislative director and counsel to U.S. Senator Terry Sanford of North Carolina. She currently serves as a senior transatlantic fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States and partner in the law firm of Cassidy Levy Kent. She is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, the president of the Trade Policy Forum, and is on the selection panel for the Harry Truman Scholarship Foundation. She has a JD from Harvard Law and an MED from Duke University. Jennifer, it's a pleasure. You have the floor.
I'm told that, is there a microphone? Do I need it for the recording? Okay. Yes. So I'm told as a keynote speaker I should stand up. So just to give you a little variety, let me start really by thanking American University, thanking Michelle, my dear friend Fernanda Nicola, and Aloisio for that lovely introduction and for inviting me to be part of, I think, really a wonderful event. I like the idea of focusing on the convergence and divergence between bilateral, regional, and multilateral trade and investment regimes. I was asked today to try to take on the issue of why, at least within the context of the TPP and the TTIP and other mega-regional agreements, the issue of why providing a specific dispute settlement mechanism for disputes over investments, known as Investor-State Dispute Settlement, or ISDS, has become such a lightning rod. For many of you that follow it, go just, for example, to one of the leading groups in Europe called Stop TTIP. And without a doubt, the number one issue on their agenda for why you should want to stop TTIP is this issue of ISDS. So I thought I would try to provide at least a little bit of context for this discussion, because I think the context is important as it focuses, again, particularly for those of you that are students in this world of international law, at looking a little bit at the sort of intertwined, sometimes separate and sometimes together worlds of international trade and trade law with investment and investment law, and the overlay over all of that by general sort of principles of international law. I think the context that I want to provide also comes from the ebb and flow that's occurred over the last century between the desires of developing countries largely to say we want to draw in more foreign investment and the desires on the other hand of investors for greater protection for their investments. And so you've seen this balance between the states and the investors, again, also ebb and flow over these years. So it's clear to me that the debate about what's the appropriate balance between investors and states is a really old one, and old even in the context within international law, customary international law. You have, on the one hand, principles that all of you that have studied international law really know about, suggesting on the one hand that states have the right to expropriate property. This is straight out. States have the right to expropriate property with compensation. And again, often within that, provided that investors have to first exhaust their domestic remedies. And for many investors, they regard that as sort of exhaust your remedies in what is viewed as a hostile home state to your domestic remedies. That's the sort of one hand. And on the other hand, you have very set forth principles in customary international law that states have a responsibility to protect aliens, foreigners, including alien and foreigners' property. So you have these two already sort of long-standing competing principles of customary international law. So out of this customary international law, very unsettled regime, grew a lot of both bilateral and multilateral approaches to try to bring more certainty and resolution to these competing principles. I mean, in the 1920s, we saw the growth of huge numbers of friendship and consular relations agreements, which again focused very heavily on that issue of what responsibility do states owe to aliens. Then you saw in the 1940s through the 1960s many numerous, friendship, commerce, and navigation agreements, what everybody studied forever, FCN agreements, again, many of them, which again, where the focus had shifted more to that other side of international law, where you really had a lot more focus on the economic and commercial interests coming to the fore in these FCN treaties. Many of these agreements combined concerns over trade and concerns over investment, with basic prohibitions on discrimination through most favored nation and national treatment clauses that pervaded through both of them, and through this notion of trade and investment as kind of looked on fairly singularly. If you think about it, then we got to the end of World War II, and a significant number of former colonial countries asserting both their independence and their desire to reclaim their natural resources and their property from their former colonial masters. So you again have this huge issue, including private investors. So you have this huge issue again of what are the rights of the state with respect to its own property and its own natural resources. So you then have coming into being the Bretton Woods institutions and what became the stillborn International Trade Organization, trying to come to terms with all of this. My own view is had the ITO actually come into fruition, we might have seen some of these issues resolved many years ago, as at least the ITO had as part of its mandate the making and reaching of an agreement on bilateral and multilateral investment rules. With the demise, however, of the International Trade Organization and the replacement of it by what is referred to as the General Agreement on Tariffs of Trade, the GATT, in 1947, you now saw the splitting, where trade went this way with all the rules on the GATT, and investment went another way where there basically weren't rules. So you had investment in a large measure going into kind of a void, whereas the GATT and the GATT dispute settlement system really took off. So into this investment void stepped many countries and the coming of what we all now talk about as bilateral investment treaties, BITs. Many scholars would cite the 1959 bilateral agreement between Germany and Pakistan as the first BIT. So 1959, again, sort of more than a decade after the GATT was formed in 1947. That agreement, that German-Pakistan agreement, contains provisions for non-discrimination, for full protection and security of the investment, for compensation against expropriation, free transfer of capital, and in terms of dispute settlement, provides initially for state-to-state, not investor-state, state-to-state disputes by the International Court of Justice if that has been mutually agreed upon by the parties. But if not, it provides for an arbitral tribunal at the request of either disputing party, including an investor. So again, here you have for the first time the notion that an investor can bring a claim against a state pursuant to a treaty entered into by these two countries. Many states followed Germany's lead, with the existence now of more than 3,200 BITs, the vast majority of which contain their own investor-state dispute settlement mechanisms. The U.S., for its part, entered into this fray in 1982 with its first BIT. The U.S. now has BITs in place with 50 countries, all of which contain an investor-state dispute settlement mechanism. I would say most of the EU member states likewise have entered into numerous BITs, with Germany leading the way, 134 BITs for Germany, followed by the UK with 105 of them, France with 103, the Netherlands with 96, Belgium with 93, Italy with 92, and the beat goes on. And again, in virtually all of these EU BITs contain investor-state dispute settlement mechanisms within them. So in response to this numerous number of BITs, efforts were made in a number of fora, most particularly the OECD, to try to bring some kind of multilateral overarching agreement on both the investment provisions themselves as well as the dispute settlement mechanisms. But the OECD countries' efforts at creating this idea of a multilateral investment agreement pretty much failed and fell apart by 1998, which leaves the rules and regimes governing international investment and their dispute settlement largely at the bilateral level. So my question sort of posing to you all is, so why all the pushing, shoving, and fighting over investment regimes and the investor-state dispute settlement mechanism now? I mean, we've had these now since 1959. Again, they've all had these ISD provisions in them. Why now? Why do we now see, again, the Stop TTIP movement and many other protesters out there complaining about ISDS? I personally attribute the clamor these days to sort of five major factors. And first, I would say I think it's really due to the increase in everything related to foreign direct investment. First and foremost, it's the sheer amount of foreign direct investment. In 1980, the level of global trade investment flows in 1980 was $20 billion. That's 20 with a B. By 1999, the annual flow of FDI had reached $1.05 trillion with a T. So you just that growth from 20 billion to $1 trillion, again, huge change. Fast forward even just to 2007, so not very many years after 1999, and the annual global flow of FDI had increased to $2.1 trillion. Arguably, its high mark. Financial crisis comes along and the flows of foreign direct investments come down, but we're still in 2013 at over at $1.4 trillion in annual FDI flows. So you have a huge growth in FDI itself. Secondly, you have a growth in the number of BITs, as I mentioned, 3,200 of them, 180 countries involved in at least one, if not more, BITs. So you simply have a lot more agreements out there over which fighting, sort of can occur. So third, and I would argue not surprisingly, there's been an increase in the agreements and in the investments made pursuant to those agreements, and that's led to an increase in the number of forums in which investor-state disputes can be brought and in the number of cases being heard. The largest forum for the resolution of investor-state disputes is the World Bank's International Center for the Settlement of Investment Disputes, known as ICSID, which has registered 492 cases since its inception in 1972. But if you look at the case numbers, there was one case in 1972, one case in 1973, no cases in 74, 75, one case, et cetera. So you had just a few cases here and there until you hit 1997, in which there were 10 or more cases. New cases being filed at ICSID, and that number has never dropped below 10. And more recently, it's been more like 30 or 40, and indeed in 2012, 50 new ICSID cases in a single year being filed. So big increase. The other popular forum, the Arbitration Institute of Stockholm, again, has seen a significant increase in the number of investor-state disputes that it is taking on. You've also seen other forums grow up, the Cairo Regional Center, the Kuala Lumpur Center, that handle both trade and investment disputes in a single forum. But again, both commercial and investor-state disputes in a single forum. So again, you've seen more forum, more rules, and more disputes, no doubt. So the number one factor to me about why are we seeing all this hullabaloo is because foreign direct investment has simply become bigger and bigger news. Second of all, I would say is, in terms of why the hullabaloo, is that the resolution of investor-state disputes has, like trade disputes, moved significantly out of the diplomatic realm and is now much more a pure juridical, pure legal dispute kind of a notion. I mean, if you think about it, largely gone are the old diplomatic methods of resolving both trade and investment disputes. I mean, when you think of the old GATT system and really these old international investment dispute settlements, they were really permeated by a culture of diplomacy, which included everything from a limited number of people were engaged in dispute settlement, most of whom knew each other or had worked together in some fashion. There was an understood objective of resolving a specific dispute in a manner that would reflect a compromise that everybody could accept. That was the goal. So the culture was perpetuated in terms of who did you select to be your arbitrators or to be on your panels. You selected diplomats who were skillful at forging compromise and who were going to be able to set very flexible deadlines. You didn't want the deadlines to get in the way of a good compromise, so you would say, take as long as it takes in order to resolve this in a way that everybody can live with it. You don't want these disputes to spill out of the GATT or trade or the investment sort of context. The disputes were seen as discrete items with limited carryover from one case to the next. Everybody thought they were just tied to the governments that were involved. They gave little thought to whether or not they needed to address the concerns of really any other non-government actors. And again, in the old sort of investment arena, most disputes started as state-to-state mechanisms. So even if you were a private investor, you had to convince your home government, please go bring a case against this other state. And so the robustness of the challenge was always tempered by the sort of foreign policy and other concerns that your home state had in terms of how vigorously was it prepared to defend a private investor's claim in a dispute with another state. The systems really did focus on the needs and concerns of government, and they did so in private. With the diplomatic culture of confidentiality and the sort of general notion of don't ask a government to make a compromise in private. If what you want is a compromise, keep it under the radar so that you're not pushing any government to give up anything publicly. So again, the idea was the whole goal here is to find a solution, not to find the best legal interpretation of a given provision, not to find the best application of the law to the facts, but find a nice diplomatic solution. Fast forward 20 years, and both the WTO and the investment dispute settlement system have now taken on a completely different tone and a completely different approach. That is a rule of law system with a purely legal culture. On the trade and the WTO side, if you think about it, due to compulsory jurisdiction, all members must bring their disputes arising under the WTO, under WTO law, to the WTO. There's now binding outcomes at the end of each dispute, a separate panels process with an appellate body created to review them. Even if you think about it, the parlance of the disputes has changed from settlement and resolution to winners, losers, victory, defeat. I mean, that is how these cases on both the trade and the investment side are increasingly talked about. This is litigation, this is battle, this is adversarial. This is no longer this sort of nice diplomatic world. If you think about it on the investment side, the move to a purely juridical system is equally as strong, with every bit these days permitting direct action by investors against the host states of the investor, where the investment is located. So we're going to leave aside the sort of diplomatic niceties of worry about the foreign relations between the two states. The investors can go directly at their claims. Again, you've moved the disputes out of